Okay, maybe I should just slowly start and then we'll see whomever might bump our meeting later onwards. Anyways, thanks a lot for coming to what we think is quite a celebrative event, namely celebrating the publication of a book that we worked on quite a while previously, became published actually at the beginning of this year. And it's wonderful to see friends and colleagues and other interested persons to attend. Actually, Carlotta is a contributor to the book who came from Brussels. So it's really wonderful to have you all on board here. Yes, so we wrote a book about the theme diversity of belonging in Europe, public spaces, contested places, and cultural encounters. And yes, we are very happy to present this to you. We have two versions that you can look at the front of this room, but the book is all open access, and yes, have a look at it if you're interested in it. Yes, we hope you enjoy it. First of all, I want to thank ACES that helped us organize this book launch. It's very nice that we could actually host this and make this into a celebratory event. And also Daci for making it run so smoothly. I mean, this is wonderful. And yeah, the people at Spy 25 being able to host this event for all of us here. So let me maybe shortly explain what we're going to do in the next 1.5 hours or so. And then I will also introduce our guest, and we'll introduce the book together. So Susanna and I will start this session by giving you some insight in what the book is about, the different chapters of that, the main ideas behind the book, so that we all have a good idea what are we actually talking about when we talk about diversity of belonging in a European context, and also what was the main idea and our contribution to this particular field. Then we have found Irene Stengs and Elizabeth Nicholson be so kind to provide us with some critical comments on the book. And I particularly asked them to help us for a further conversation about researching this topic of belonging in Europe. You know, what does it add? What are the challenges of the field? And to which topics does it connect when we particularly talk about Europe and diversity? And because these are, of course, broad themes, and we've made an attempt to work with that, and we hope to take that further in future research. Then, of course, we'll open the floor for questions, and there's some drinks afterwards, but that's a bit what you're going to expect here in the next 1.5 hours or so. But let me first introduce today's speakers, and I will say also a few words about myself. Susanna Eckersley, who's sitting next to me. I have co-authored the book together with her. She's a professor at Newcastle University, but also an associate research fellow at the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, Germany. And she was the very, I would say, dedicated project leader of Encounter Point, which was the starting point behind this book. It was one of the things we wanted to have as an end product, and we're very glad that we can present it here today. Her expertise is really in memory, museums, difficult heritage, migration, identities, and of course, belonging. Susanna has recently started a new research project, which I think links up nicely to the chapter she has submitted to this book, which is about cultural dynamics, museums, and democracy in motion. So that is Susanna. Irene, the discussant, one of the discussants of today's session, senior researcher at the Meertens Institute and professor by special appointment in the anthropology of ritual and popular culture at the Vrije Universiteit, or Free University, here in Amsterdam. And her research in the Netherlands and in Thailand as well focuses on popular religiosity, material culture, commemorative ritual, and processes of heritage formation to start with, and also published a book where belonging featured a role in this. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us as well as a discussant, a lecturer cultural heritage at the University of Aberdeen. Her research examines how political rhetoric and funding structures influence heritage governance and ideas of a shared past. But you have also published widely on European Union identity, politics, and more recently, which I think relates very much to what we're doing here today, on populist radical right movements in Scandinavia. And actually quite recently, she edited the book Polarized Past, Heritage and Belonging in Times of Political Polarization. I'm an anthropologist and assistant professor here at the University of Amsterdam and a co-editor of the book, part of the Department of European Studies at the Humanities faculty. And in my research, I particularly focus on the intersection of EU funding, cultural activism and enlargement, and have focused quite extensively over the past years on European cultural policy, cultural heritage, Southeast Europe, in particular former Yugoslavia, and European identity formation. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the different people that we have on board here. I will ask Susanna now to start off with the introduction of our book and really exploring more what is the main idea behind it, how do we aim to contribute to the main debates, and I hope to also provide you some insights in the several chapters of the book.
Thank you. Is my mic on? It's not yet. It's on. Okay. So I hope you can all hear me. So as Klaska said, this book emerged from a research project which I led. And that project came from a funding call that came out in 2015 from HERA, Humanities in the European Research Area, which was on the topic of public spaces, culture and integration in Europe. And in response to this call, I gathered together a group of scholars who were working in very different disciplines and around different places in Europe to develop the project that we called Encounter Points, Renegotiating Belonging Through Culture and Contact in Public Space and Place. And our aim within that project was to see if we could work in interdisciplinary ways, not only to understand the renegotiations of belonging in Europe, but also a little bit to kind of reset or reframe the call topic a little away from the rather formalized idea of integration and towards the broader idea of belonging, non-belonging, and diversity. And within that project, we had 5 teams from different universities around Europe, so University of Newcastle, where I'm from, University of Amsterdam, where Klaska led her team, Politecnico di Milano in Italy, the University of Warsaw, and the Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam in Germany. And across our different teams, we had different specialisms. Some of us looked at museums, some of us researched urban public spaces. We had a team looking at religious and migrant community centers. Klaska looked at arts and cultural actors in Southeast Europe. And we also had a team looking at historical built heritage reconstructions. And this is really what formed the basis of the book, which was one of the key outputs of that project. So that's why I'm giving you a little bit the backstory here. And we really felt that the interdisciplinary nature of the project was one of the really key strengths of our project and where we felt there were areas of added value that we wanted to kind of expand on in the book. So we took it a little further with the book by inviting scholars from beyond the Encounter Points project to join us. We have people who joined us from different career stages, again, from more different and diverse academic fields from around Europe. And you can see that if you look at the chapter list, hopefully you can see the diversity of the topics that people are looking at, a diversity of approaches in terms of disciplinary approaches, also methods and theories. And we feel that's a real advantage of our book, something that we're, I think, very proud of, that it manages to do that. So within the Encounter Points project, but particularly within the book, we argue that belonging and also not belonging is something that lies really at the core of the many recent crises and ongoing processes of change that continue to shape and to shake up contemporary Europe. We looked at new forms of socio-spatial inclusion and exclusion, things that have been both embraced but also contested, but which are always negotiated and renegotiated as part of these ongoing processes of social change connected to the topics that we looked at, whether that was migration and displacement, post-socialism and decolonisation, populism and polarisation, connected to those specific areas that we've talked about. And we feel that as a result of these processes, new challenges connected to belonging have really emerged, and they're really starting to crystallize around Europe. The reinvention, politicization, renewal, and the destruction of identities and of forms or symbols of collective belonging, often connected to ideas of culture, heritage, and memory, are evident in societies across Europe and societies connected to Europe and beyond Europe. So facing these transformative processes that challenge the diversity of belonging, in our book we aim to try to provide insights into how these impact on identification with, but also alienation from, diverse practices and discourses of belonging at different scales and from multiple perspectives. So we focused on the ways in which renegotiations of belonging have been and continue to be played out through cultural encounters with difference and change in a variety of public spaces and also in contested places. One thing that the book does not aim to do is to provide a comparative overview of every country or every region in Europe, and it doesn't primarily address belonging to Europe through a focus on top-down notions of formal belonging to the European Union. Instead, what we really wanted to do was to provide a kind of an album of snapshots that collected the analyses of different multi-layered encounters, different places and spaces of belonging, and to address these through a diversity of theoretical and disciplinary approaches. And the chapters together, we argue, call for a more nuanced understanding of the diversity of belonging in, to, and for Europe. Now, belonging itself, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a complex, fluid, and really quite slippery term, one which is used by different academic disciplines in quite different ways. And much of the academic analysis of belonging has tended to follow into different disciplinary focuses. But in order to understand and analyze the complexity and the multimodal nature of belonging, we sought in our book to try and blur these disciplinary boundaries and to try to consider instead belonging from multiple perspectives simultaneously. So we aim to try to expand on and to contribute to the existing but somehow slightly dispersed literature on belonging that already exists. Within the book, we focused particularly on three significant and very interconnected dimensions of how belonging connects to the self relationally, to the wider world. So firstly, we looked at dimensions of belonging that are focused on people or communities, what we called socially located belonging. Secondly, we looked at those forms of belonging that are focused on place, what we called spatially located belonging. And then thirdly, we focused on the way in which belonging is often connected to time and memory, what we call temporally located belonging. And we saw that these dimensions of belonging are deeply interconnected and often overlapping, and that this complexity lies at the core of the analyses in the different chapters of the book. And when we look at multiple forms of public spaces within the book, we also felt that very often the articulation of public spaces as shared cultural spaces or of places of encounter for Europe's diverse populations, very often we think that these gloss over the controversies, the competing voices and the power dynamics that exist within these kind of spaces of public culture. And that public places and spaces are really where many of the contests and negotiations over belonging take place. So these diverse processes of renegotiation that take place at these sites of cultural encounter, which are often simultaneously, to use Anna Tsing's word, zones of awkward engagement, provide a basis for understanding, we felt, the multiple ways in which belonging is conceived and practiced, both in individual public places and for a collective, imagined public space of belonging to, as well as in and for Europe. And now I pass you over to Klaske, who will introduce some of the chapters of the book.
Yeah, because of course the question is now, how did that translate itself into the different chapters of the book? I tried to also visualize it a little bit by giving you a series of actual visuals. This is actually one that is made by Elizabeth, sort of trying to connect to different themes and topics in our book, but also the several spaces that we looked at. On the slide, you will see passing by religious centers next to urban interventions into big cities of Europe, into museum spaces next to quite a few other occasions where we see a connection between space and belonging. And to give you a bit of an insight in how that has been translated, I've also added some material here. So I think the important thing for us was we had these ideas behind the book. We wanted indeed to add to the rather dispersed field of belonging and to rethink theoretical models. And we also really wanted to look at how can we do that more interdisciplinary, and how can we also do that by looking at diverse context spaces. And of course, for us, the main question was how to indeed make sure that we don't just collect snapshots, to have a photo album with several pictures dispersed all over the album, but how to make sure actually this has meaning, that this has a clear narrative, a way in which the chapters are connected. So that's what I'm going to say a bit more about, so what our idea was. And in several meetings we organized in preparation for the books, where we joined together as a theme, we really discussed, so how do we all interpret belonging? How do we all as a team work with this? How do we interrelate these interpretations of belonging to wider debates about Europe? And what kind of debates on Europe? And how do we see crossovers between these interpretations and notions when looking at each other's chapters? And I think that was really the challenge we were facing before we translated this into the book that we currently have. So this resulted in the current book, where we ordered our snapshots into a series of 12 chapters and divided them into 2 parts. Which, of course, also speak to each other. Actually, the slides have stopped, I think. Yeah, I don't know, but that's all right. They might return back. But the first part of the book is called Redefining and Negotiating Public Spaces of Belonging. And the idea was, in this first part of the book, is to really examine the complexities, challenges, but also the potential of active interventions. So I think that was really central in the first part of the book. Both by institutions, so museums, as well by grassroots acting. How can you intervene and by doing that create spaces of belonging? That was really the connecting part of the first one. And how can that be done in public spaces to instigate and recognize very often new forms of belonging? So this active intervention is central in this first part of the book. So the 6 chapters in this part really explore how new museum practices, discourses, architectural mediation, so also by architecture intervening in public spaces, but also by means of funding schemes, how can this impact on the active development of new spaces of belonging? So the different chapters included in this part of the book really address questions such as, what does it mean to create spaces and places of belonging in Europe? What does it mean to intervene in existing socio-political landscapes of belonging or alineations? And what are the effects of these kind of interventions? So to make this a bit more concrete, we have a chapter that Susanne contributed to, where we really look at how museums can act as a form of a democratic public space. In her research for this, she focuses on Germany and really looks at the attempts made by museums to transform them into sites where belonging can be staged, where it can be displayed in a more democratic way. And she concludes that belonging, as well as non-belonging, still remains embedded into power structures which are upheld by these museums, so very much determined by that. Another example, chapter 2, focuses on religious communities in Warsaw, and there you see a comparison between Muslim, Ukrainian and Vietnamese communities, where the authors really argue that belonging is not a fixed social identity, but it's actually often a discursive tool used both by the communities themselves, but also by those in power, which allows them to negotiate their space, not only in Warsaw, but also in the wider context of Europe. Then we have a few chapters that really focus on the intervention in urban centers, urban spaces. One does it more in a historical perspective, focusing on Berlin and Potsdam, and focusing on the revitalization of city centers after Germany's reunification, where the observation is that the intervention in public space really also mobilize and politicize groups that are becoming engaged in the politics of belonging, so to really intervene in this. And the other chapter that focuses on urban interventions does this more from a bottom-up perspective, where we have the focus on community centered intervention into this space by means of tactics, urban design, architectural interventions. And we see here really how in cities like Rome, for example, big squares are filled to really open up for spaces where communities can be invited and come together. So a different approach to this kind of topic. Also, like I said before, we have a few chapters, amongst which also Carlotta's, which is focusing more on the impact of funding schemes or EU governance kind of interventions and what they actually do, where one is more on the development of the Year of Cultural Heritage and how that plays out, and really looking at, okay, so how does this institutional design of EU governance lead to the adoption of, in this case, a rather formalized discourse, and how that maybe unquestion ideas of belonging, or at least show a very particular interpretation of that. And in my own chapter, I looked at the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Northern Macedonia, and Serbia, and really looked at how these funding schemes had rather unexpected results and often showed more non-belonging to these kind of projects and much more an investment in creation of spaces of belonging in their local context, which to some extent the EU funding could convene. So a different kind of this. But it's all about intervention and how that led, to new insights into this theme. Now, regarding the other part of the book, we focus much more on the encountering of contested belongings in public spaces. So contestation is quite central. We have that to some extent in the first part of the book as well, but it comes much more to the foreground in the second part of the book, where we really focus on public spaces that have become sites of cultural encounter in which contested and complex forms of belonging are becoming renegotiated, newly discussed. Again, we focus here on different sites, heritage, memory, everyday use, that are linked to these sites. And it's really about collective processes of engagement with previously very often hidden or silenced or unwanted or sometimes even undesired forms of belonging. And it's also very much about how to counteract these kind of narratives of belonging that dominated institutionalized structures and power dynamics. So we see that a lot in the second part of the book. Let me see if I'm still, yes, on track. We see here heritage sites, museums, statues as well, which become sites in which diverse notions of belonging intersect. And they often result from the presence of social historical legacies that are considered contested or marginalized within Europe. But also we discuss contestations over, for example, the socialist or colonial past in these chapters. We also see that in these different chapters, the sites that we focus on are often positioned at so-called fault lines within contemporary heritage, memory, and museum practices, and are often strongly affected by the power dynamics at play around them. So to give you some examples, we see in one of the chapters the reinvention of memory, identity and belonging in post-socialist Romania. So again, another context where we focus on, the author is really looking at some prominent museums, the Elie Wiesel House and the Sziget Memorial Museums, which are both referring to different kinds of historical legacies, one the Second World War and the Holocaust narrative, the other one much more about the socialist past. And the author reveals how re-interventions at these particular sites are strongly influenced by legacies of perceived colonialism under the Soviet Union, as well as by normative language of international intervention. So they determine very much what's happening there, which often creates frictions with more local interpretations of belonging. Then we have another chapter focusing on so-called foreign heritage in Warsaw. Again, very much focusing on the forgotten legacies of the Soviet times and how, within the city structures has been dealt with this kind of heritage sites, relating that to tourist guides and how people actually encounter these spaces in a sort of daily cityscape of Warsaw here. Then again, we had a chapter on the urban development of Berlin in the post-reunification period, and particularly focused on the Mitte, Spreeinsel. And here it's really a large discussion about several actors involved in urban planning processes and the complexities of all of that and how that has played out. And in particular, it becomes clear again, it has led to a marginalization of dissenting approaches within this context. Then we have Kahlenberg, Vienna, the siege of Vienna, 1683. So one of our authors is really going to Vienna to discuss actually how it's been dealt with narratives about the Ottoman past, but relating this, I would say, historical narrative to a rather contemporary development which is happening in social media, where you see that far-right organizations are actually relating to this past in new ways and really giving new dimensions to how to deal with this particular contested site in European memory building in this case. Now, the last two chapters really deal with the colonial past, so we bring that in particular in the last two sections. First one in museums in the UK, reflecting on the Windrush scandal as well as Brexit, where we also see, similar to the chapter of Susanne, how museums really try to, open up for debates about these topics, these contested themes, but fail to meaningfully engage with the structural inequalities they try to dissolve. So it's really about the struggle of the museums. And the final chapter is about the toppling of the Colston statue. Again, a relationship with social media. So how actually in response to what happened here, we see debates emerging about racism in Europe. And this author is actually arguing that these spaces of encounter might actually lead to new platforms to open up debates. So it's a different storyline than the one that's talking about the siege in Vienna, where it's been really more an extremist dialogue that emerged at social media. So I hope this gave you a bit of the snapshots of our book and how we tried to connect to different the parts of them, really focusing on interventions, but as well on contested sites and how that has played out in different contexts. And what we try to really do is that this brings indeed a more nuanced understanding of the diversity of belonging in Europe. And we hope it's a good starting point for a continued debate about this topic and how to undertake this kind of research, because a lot is happening right now. We see a shift from a theme of diversity to belonging, for example, also in institutions like the European Union. Why is that the case? What do we do with that? And how is it both a connector, bringing in communities, but also a very divisive matter that excludes, who belongs and who does not belong, and are you part of a space or are you out of a particular space? I think that is really what triggered us to write the book, but also a main idea behind our launch today. How can we connect this to the themes, heritage, belonging? What are the challenges, and how can we take that further? Not an easy task, but I mean, we've asked Elisabeth and Irene to maybe reflect already a bit on what we've tried to do, and then we start off a discussion about this, which will then also open up to the rest of the audience to say, okay, what do we learn actually from this, and what do we learn from these kind of snapshot moments that actually give us a bigger picture on what's happening in Europe right now. So I'm going to ask Irene to start off. I would suggest that both of you provide your comments, and that then together Susanne and I will provide a response to that, and then we'll open up for discussion. Yeah?
Thank you. Yeah, first of all for your invitation, but more importantly, for the invitation, but more importantly for, let me congratulate you, Susanne and Klaske, with the publication of this interesting volume. And I admire how you have succeeded in bringing together such a diverse and wide range of research foci, each spotlighting certain aspects of possibilities or impossibilities of experiences of belonging in an ever-changing Europe. So the title, Diversity of Belonging in Europe, is aptly chosen. My short presentation here actually is based on a very brief triple jump selective reading of the chapters, and then again a selection of that. So there's a bit of a repetition, but I've tried to reformulate it. What I liked very much was the choice to largely move beyond a Western European or European Union selection of societies, where your snapshots, indeed, as you call them, are located, and instead offer a perspective on Central, Eastern and Southeast European experiences, often considered as the margins. And I consider this an achievement because there is a Western ethnocentric bias in much of our understanding of Europe, here in the Netherlands and in other EU countries. Very justified that you also included the after Brexit UK as a new European margin. The broader issue at stake here is indeed which nations do and which nations do not belong to Europe as a social, political, cultural or economic entity. Due to my personal interest in heritage contestations and commemorative culture, I concentrated more or less a bit on the second part. And I read, for instance, that chapter that you also already just mentioned, the text which is titled Taxonomies of Pain, Mutual Embodiments of Identity and Belonging in Post-Communist Romania by Carmen Levick. I don't know, yeah? So the mutual embodiments, you mentioned it already briefly, are Elie Wiesel Memorial House, that's opened in 2002, and the anti-communist Siget Memorial Museum, which opened in 2000. These are located in the border city of Siget, a place that carries actually 3 names, a Hungarian name, a Romanian name, and a German name, and this already sets the stage for the complex colonial history and the obstacles that complicate embedding in a narrative of European memory and belonging. A setting which is not specific for Siget, but is valid for many Eastern European places. And that makes the case study so well chosen, as it exemplifies larger tensions, anxieties, and complications that are at stake in Europe today. The Elie Wiesel Memorial House, that's the birth and childhood place of Elie Wiesel, and the Siget Memorial Museum, that is housed in a former prison for anti-communists, coexist in the same commemorative space, but encapsulates 2 conflicting master narratives of European cultural memory, the Holocaust and communism. The author positions the creation of the memorials in a situation that Romania and other East European countries found themselves after 1989. And the urgent necessity to fill the vacuum that the disappearance of a communist identity left. So it has to be filled with a new identity towards an open European identity, which emphasizes the positive values of inclusion and multiculturalism. And that had to be done before nationalist, conservative-oriented forces would fill that vacuum with their interpretation of Romanian heritage and their selections of past events. And with the wisdom of hindsight, we can say that these forces actually have never been contained. But anyhow. The Siget commemorative space is such a complicated space because it is an encapsulation of both the narrative of the life and work of Nobel Prize for Peace laureate Elie Wiesel, and subsequently the fate of the local Jewish community, and the Christian narrative of Romanian resistance against communism, and which is regarded as part of Romanian national heritage. The story of this resistance conceals its co-founding of anti-Jewishness. Yet the aesthetics employed in the memorial reveal who belong to this space of memory and who do not belong to this space of memory of commemoration. So I cannot, of course, go into the details of this, but it is very well presented how actually these memorials work. Then what I found interesting, actually, that although they are, how do you call it, counterpoints, they actually employ similar sensorial techniques to evoke a particular kind of aesthetic engagement in the visitor. That's, I thought, so evoking contemplations on peace, for instance. So now I make a big jump, but I think I can make it to the chapter of Susanna. That's actually in the first part then. That is on museums as a public space of belonging. Another jump here. I agree with her conclusion that the museums that were part of her research did not really achieve to become inclusive, irrespective of the sincere and enduring efforts and initiatives of curators and museum professionals. And these are the policies that Susanna captures as transformative actions. Such results, these failures, from the fact that the museum's envisioned public audience is the majority of the population in a certain society. And this majority has to be convinced of the importance of diversity, inclusivity and tolerance towards minorities. And herewith, unintentionally, these museum policies replicate the already existing power and control structures they try to overcome. This outcome, unintended outcome, is also well illustrated in the chapter of Helen Mears, which is called Staged Claims of Belonging, where she discusses an exhibition on the Windrush generation after the Windrush scandal. I don't know what you know about it. It's actually the same situation that we have in the Netherlands here, a little bit, but on a much larger scale, as with the pardonners. People actually who actually could not reach out or were entitled towards full citizenship, although in this case they arrived in the UK 50 years ago. And actually their arrival from as Caribbean laborers is regarded as the birth of the multicultural Britain. So it's actually, I think that this last chapter on the exhibition, which is titled A Nice Cup of Tea in the Ashmolean Collection of Oxford, which is a ceramics museum, is wonderful. I cannot go into the precise detail, but what it also shows is how temporarily this time artists from a Caribbean descent are invited to make the exhibition, but that's it. After that, the exhibition will end and things will continue as they already were at forehand. And I think that's precisely it's an important insight, because this reproduction of the existing hierarchies might help to shed light on the success or failure of European or other intervention politics, which are developed to create or stimulate inclusivity or belonging. Replication is, in other words, possibly always implicated in a formal politics of belonging. I think if you want to think about more analytically, maybe this might be one dimension. I'm not saying that you're not analytically and all, but just to move it one step further. And then the next step is, so could one designate, well, at least then in the museum context, but I think it's wider, is a wider validity to this, an overall not intentional tendency in such initiatives to lean forwards toward kind of a form of patronizing attitude. It's a bit similar to the notion of tolerance, which is also often attached to processes of belonging or the sense of belonging. These are hallmarks of civilization, but actually there are demarcated communities along moral lines in an unequal playing field. I find it complicated to grasp belonging conceptually. Is it a notion or a concept? Or term? You use the word term, I noticed. The case studies show how belonging or non-belonging evolves from a set of political and historical processes forged by the European or by a national self-image or that of a religion or that of a region. So so contemplating on this, I thought of an understanding of belonging as a boundary object, a term introduced by the sociologists Susan Leigh Starr and James Griesemer. A boundary object is an object which lives in multiple social worlds and which has different identities in each. It's plastic enough to adapt to the local needs and constraints of the several parties employing it, yet robust enough to maintain a common identity across sides. The boundary object perspective may help to shed light on how different parties, whether that be European policymakers, museum professionals, or local heritage activists, under different circumstances, may engage in diverse practices aimed at establishing diverse experiences of belonging, while ostensibly, on a moral, political, or whatever level, talking about the same thing. This comes close to the insights of the Canadian anthropologist Tanya Murray-Lee, who spoke of a global conjuncture of belonging, where she points to the fact that, and I quote her, all sorts of apparently unrelated trends converge into turning belonging into a pressing issue. Much of this aligns with the approach also articulated in the volume. Understanding the pressing issueness of belonging requires a focus on the level of social practices. Where do people meet? What are the material and structural needs to give shape to inclusivity or to belonging? Under what conditions may experience of belonging be realized? As the editors in the introduction say, belonging is often a shorthand for a sense of belonging. It's about a feeling, it's about the affective and emotions. So what I missed a bit are the moments and situations when such emotive engagements, when people feel to belong, or equally important, feel not to belong, are realized. For instance, that might be in ritual. So maybe that's my hang-up as a researcher on ritual and popular culture, but I thought. So what resonates intensively? When are people somehow half engaged? Or when are people not really understanding the objective of the place or the event? That's, I think. And finally, I have a very different question. Since belonging is such a pressing issue, it has become an established object of research. Could you elaborate a bit on why the, to me, important work, also in theoretical perspective, of Jan Willem Duivendak on home, nostalgia and belonging, and Peter Geschiere, who wrote the book The Perils of Belonging, and also he has an elaborate take on shared sensorial perceptions of the world, has, as it seems, not been of much use for your approach or your understanding of belonging.
Thanks a lot, Irene.
All right, here we go. Yeah, thank you so much, Irene. That was really, I would say, quite in depth. Really, yeah, you sparked a lot of thoughts. And we have focused on some of the similar things, actually, which is interesting too with the book. Yeah. So, yeah, let me first say as well, thank you for inviting me, of course, to this event and give me opportunity to comment on this important book. So it's often a long process to produce a volume like this, and they tend, unfortunately, I think, to be undervalued in academia, these types of works. They are, I would say, extremely vital, though, as a format for academic conversation, as a knowledge contribution, because they represent these carefully curated sort of works, but they are at the same time more unrestricted than a lot of the other types of journal articles that we are pushed to produce really fast. So they allow more room to explore, to have more detail and to reflect. And I think this is something that you do really well in this volume. So you manage to explore this diversity, and you put belonging in a new context and a wider setting than I would say it's been previously in the research literature I've read on the concept. So, so my background is in archaeology and in heritage studies. So I've always, I love the interdisciplinarity you have in this book because, we talked about it at lunch, actually, the fact that often when you're in a specific discipline like archaeology, it will be any discipline, you often have to defend what you're doing as part of that discipline, and you've actually managed to do something really interdisciplinary here. So I also appreciate that there's no question or part of the book where you state how many disciplines are in it, exactly like why you included certain parts, but it's just about belonging. You start from belonging. So this is actually really truly interdisciplinary in that sense. So I think, a couple of really good things, thinking a little bit more about structure of the volume and things like that first too. one reason I like it is that you take this care in creating this framework. So you have these two parts, and their introductions, they really guide the reader and make sure that a book like this is more than the sum of its parts. So you could have made it quite easy for yourself, I think, and just looked at museums maybe in one section. You could have gone for monuments. You could have gone for policy, which is also a strong feature of the book. But you could also have chosen a geographical division, which is very common in these types of books that deal with diversity and such. So yeah, but you decided to take a harder route, I would say, to tease out how the chapters speak with each other and move towards some common insights. So in the book, when you will read it, and you all should because it's excellent, you will find Achim and Kristin, for example, who both have chapters on that really are about Reformation in Berlin and after German reunification. But they are placed in different sections because they relate to different analytical foci. So one more historical, one more contemporary. And you also find chapters of the diversity of belonging in Warsaw that you have already noted by Malgorzata. She does one chapter on her own, and then the other by Malgorzata, Grazinia, and Joanna in other sections. So they're also they're about the same city, similar issues, but they're angled very differently, and so they're in different sections. This really brings the volume to life, I would say, and ensures that it has its own diversity. So. Secondly, you all have a really sound empirical footing, and you pay attention to method. So you use a lot of different approaches like discourse analysis, ethnography, and social inquiry. And I would say, based on my experience, it's quite rare with edited volumes that can also act as a way to help you or help students to understand how methods can be used in an effective way. But this volume actually has that part in it too. So I think it could also work as a teaching asset. So it's a good quality of this book. So third, and thinking more then about content. So what struck me is that it's very balanced in terms of what can be considered positive and negative processes of asserting or fostering belonging. So, I mean, to be honest, on first impression, when you asked me to have a look at the book and talk about it, I learned that it's from the HERA project originally, and it's EU-funded. And part of my research has been about analyzing how EU projects work and what they produce in my own field in terms of archaeology and heritage projects that get EU funding. What do they come up with? So I've analyzed over 160 EU projects and their outputs to see what do they do with the money, what happens. So at first I was like, oh no, maybe this is just one of these other buzzword-heavy celebrations of European unity that has, maybe an output put together quite quickly because you have a reporting deadline and so forth. So, but I was very happily, surprised. So don't worry, it didn't. Those expectations were, it wasn't true. So I found that, and what was impressive, that it's a relatively neutral but quite probing tone in sort of the introduction to the book. But it gives way to some really highly critical texts. And it really takes into account the fact that the processes of belonging does not always produce what we would see as positive outcomes. We often think of that, especially if we're in a humanistic academic bubble, as increased democratic participation, social equality, or the de-escalation of conflict. So this was something that, this negative side is something that was focused on more than I thought it would be initially. So I think, and that is really important as well, to have that dual focus. So you show that they can that belonging can reaffirm differences and escalate conflict. So often this happens, as you've shown, through a disconnect between visions and structures or practice and implementation. But you don't end up in a sort of a doomsday scenario in the book, but you explore these alternative processes of placemaking, transformation, and strategies that people use to circumvent these sort of structural issues. So, and there's one line in the chapter by Giacopo, Francesca, and Francesca, where they talk about urban design efforts, and at the end that I think sort of symbolizes the book quite well, and it says, the real effort that this kind of regeneration that they talk about requires, but replace that for this type of book project requires, is not problem solving, but problem setting. Setting the conditions for citizens to negotiate and renegotiate their belonging to the public dimension. So that's something that I think really comes through. So yeah, your book could have been called something dark, like On Dark and Contested Pasts, something intriguing like that, but you've chose a more hopeful and productive approach, I think, placing belonging at the center of politics in the process of creating it. So each chapter has a sort of a lesson to learn there. So I thought to structure 3 sort of small comments and questions based on the chapters that I've read. And I mean, I have read all of them, but also like you, I have browsed through some of the content because it's very rich. So one of them is like, how do we break the feedback loop in these top-down approaches to belonging that you do find to be problematic, and you commented on them as well. This sort of, whether it's about the museums and their relation to urban regeneration, or if it's national and EU governance. Sometimes it seems there is this feedback loop where a lot of projects tend to sort of, who works with it, they realize that the power structures it catches them in the end. Like they think the road to inclusivity is paved with good intentions, but in the end it doesn't really go all the way through. So I found, in my research on the EU, and when it comes to attempts to foster a sense of European belonging through heritage actions, that's been ongoing since the 1970s, I found that a lot of the problem was a parallel approach to what it means to belong in Europe. So on the one hand, you have this side which places authority in the past, in a European commonality based on roots and place that is manifested in monuments, in sites, and in time periods. So actually, when announcing the European Year of Cultural Heritage in 2018, which Carlotta Scioldo, who is here today, writes about in the book, the Culture Commissioner Tibor Navrasic, he fell back on this essentialist idea of what it means to be European. So he said, there is such a thing as a European identity. It's clear this European identity finds its strongest expression in European culture. So even if there is this side now that places authority in the present, where there's a more flexible understanding of European heritage as heritage of everyone who lives in Europe today and in the past, I found that this flexible understanding, much like you say in your chapter where you talk about the unquestioned idea of belonging, that these soft tools that you discuss in relation to the European Year of Cultural Heritage, how they lead to this subtle processes of socialization. So I found that, for example, also among when I interviewed a lot of archaeologists who worked with these heritage projects and archaeologists. So yeah, they said essentially that what they did was application poetry. So they wrote what they thought the EU wanted to hear. So they wrote that the European identity existed already in the Bronze Age because they thought that's what the EU wanted to hear. But in the end, what they wrote in the report was the same thing. And this creates, and now I'm coming back finally to the point, this creates this sort of feedback loop where what goes into the final report and what goes back into the museum reports about what happened with these processes, which you call the paradigm of difference. So museum as a public space of control rests on a paradigm of difference. So in the end, what comes through in the policies and the reports is usually that it was very successful and that everything went the way it should and that belonging was created just as intended. So how do we break this feedback loop that I see in so many of the chapters? And also the importance, of course, of this duality of the parallel vision of belonging that comes through in many of the chapters that I think really, especially perhaps in David Farrell Banks, when he talks about the meaning of the places in Kallenberg that relates to the 1683 Ottoman siege of Vienna, how they have become reactivated in the landscape of the far right and how they create their sense of belonging to this on a new scale. So part of that, we see a localization of belonging, of a type of negative, that we would say a negative belonging, but also an internationalization of these types of belonging on a more of a, they talk about the internationalization of nationalism is something that is often sort of brought up in this context and something he touches upon as well in this text. So that relates to the second question is that how, and you also talked about it, how heritage, borders, and belonging, when they're talked about as soft processes and emotional processes, how that still contrast to the hard delineators in society. Because what a lot of these far right groups draw on are not, it's well established sort of ideas in society and frameworks of belonging that is already there. So they are, as many have said too, they're a symptom of something rather than that they are a movement in their own right. So it's good and it's interesting to really look at these processes like you do with the sort of the interlinked triggers between the religion and all of these aspects that relate to belonging. But when it comes to when you're standing at a border somewhere and someone asks you where you're from, there's the question of where do you actually belong. So belonging will always, I think, to some extent, relate to land ownership, to placing people. So you have talked about a lot of alternative strategies in the book for this, but I would love to hear more about how you think about how to fight or how to work to loosen this idea, these hard borders that relate to belonging, which are a little bit harder, I think, to just, to work with. So I think within that question, it relates to also this grammar of participation and like this taking for granted frameworks of who belongs and who doesn't belong, essentially, that you work. So some examples from David's chapters of this, how to work against this is, for example, he talks about how you can have an intercultural dialogue around some of the Ottoman remains in Vienna, like the Turkischer Brunnen. So how there has been an idea about bringing people to these places instead of the Kallenberg and places that are sort of already adopted by far-right movements. But there's no power behind that it doesn't find enough interest among people to actually create a sort of a counter idea of belonging. So, how do we deal with this hard frameworks around belonging and borders? Lastly, I wanted to ask you about methods. So I think based on the book with so many interesting sort of methods and convergence of methods, there's some of you who focus on studying up, some of you who focus on the middle sort of aspects and the relationship in between layers and publics and officials, and some of you that works with people who would be considered studying down in the sense of you being a researcher and academic in a sort of a privileged position. So what do you see as the most productive way for studying belonging going forward? Lastly, one question that I know I came up with, that, and then I'm done, I promise, is if belonging is really the solution. Because you talked about belonging as, is it a good thing that we're working so much with belonging now? It is a new sort of buzzword. It is something that people are interested in working with. In many ways, it has replaced identity, and does. But should we really, it's belonging. We know that belonging can have positive and negative effects, but what about just dwelling in a place? Can we allow for a more transitory way? I mean, do we always have to find belonging in everywhere we go to we know psychologically we need to belong somewhere, but I also feel like it tends to place us, it tends to locate us somewhere. And maybe we also need to move away from belonging in some cases. Right.
Okay. Thanks a lot for both comments. It's quite something to tackle. So I guess Susanne and I will just make a start, and then I guess integrate that also with questions from the public, and maybe just shortly respond to some of the main points, and then open up. I don't know if you want to start, Susanne, or I'll.
Yeah, I'm happy to
jump in whenever.
So I was just going to start perhaps by trying to bring together your first question, Irina, and your last point, because I think they relate to one another in a way. So your first question was around the question of whether we missed moments and engagements when the feeling of belonging and not belonging was being realized through our research for the book. And I think, you've hit on a really important point that was something that we really wanted to do. One of the key things that we didn't mention in the introduction to the book is that the majority of the field work, certainly from the Encounter Points project, that was planned to be the foundation for the book, was due to begin in March 2020. So this created, obviously, a significant problem. I know Klaska had to change plans hugely. I had to change plans. Most of the authors involved in the book had to sort of reframe what they wanted to do around which participants, which interlocutors they could approach safely and within the constraints of different lockdowns in different countries and different situations. And this meant that certainly in in terms of my research and Helen's research in museums, that we weren't able to work with museum visitors because it wasn't possible. Because of the pandemic. So I think that, that is something that I think we all wanted to do, and we think it's really important, and would, if we were to do this project again, and this book again in different times, it would be there more evidently than it could be because of the, just the situation we were in, which is the unfortunate reality that we had to face. Your question about is belonging the solution, I have to, in a way, I would say I don't think we think it is. Mm-hmm. I think we feel that belonging is perhaps, and belonging and not belonging. So I would always use those two together. That is part of the it's what seems to be creating a huge number of problems at the moment. It's what seems to be at the core of things. So it clearly is deeply important. And at the same time, if it creates so many divisions and contests, there's obviously a problem with it. So it isn't the solution, it's the problem, I think. And that's what we're trying to begin to think about as to why is it the problem, when actually often perhaps in the, in the policies and the kind of political discourses, it's seen as a solution. But of course it isn't a solution, even though belonging is deeply important to people. Let me think. And then I was also just going to you also mentioned this idea of whether belonging is something that kind of fundamentally in some way locates us, positions us in place. And I think also, and maybe this is what we would, you know, again, if we were doing more work on belonging, that we would look more, again, connected to the way in which you can access people that you want to work with, or, you know, to understand their sense of belonging. We also felt very strongly that belonging is about more than place, and that belonging is very much about societies and groups and, you know, what people do, what we do, how we engage with one another, not necessarily connected to place, even though place has to be part of it in a way, but that place shouldn't or isn't always the most important part of it. And this is where it gets complicated in the different languages of thinking about the way in which the word belonging is framed and what it means.
One of my questions
Yeah.
was asked, how is it translated in Greek or
Yeah.
whatever? Yeah. So actually that was one of my questions. How does belonging translate in different languages? What words are used actually to refer to something like that? Yeah. So I think
it's deeply complicated and difficult, even just with the languages that you know, that we speak between us and that the other authors in the volume speak. You know, it means different things in German to English. They're the languages that I use in my research, and so it's always about, you know, we always were trying to kind of, both in terms of working together in order to create the book, but also in our research, trying to just think about what do we mean in this situation around belonging. Is it around people? Is it around a kind of top-down identity or a citizenship, which in some circumstances, that's what people see as belonging, as a formalized citizenship, whereas we sort of articulate it much more as a reciprocal process of being part of something.
Yes, I think if we want to think more, can I respond just to? I think if indeed it's this idea of this notion of belonging is something out in the world. It's a phenomenon. So as researchers, we have to deal with it or relate to it. That's one dimension. Then it's worthwhile also in for future research not to just use the word belonging, but actually the whole complexities of translation as part of the ethnographies or case studies that we are actually including in our volumes.
Yeah, I would fully agree. Now, I was also thinking, is belonging a solution? I think we saw it also as an alternative or as something that was indeed worthwhile studying, and particularly in relation to the wider project we were engaging in, which had a lot to do with place and space. And there, very often, we felt like identity is maybe not covering it all or parts of it. You know, of course, these are slippery. They are very interrelated. But I do think it's really, you know, something we need to have a look at in all its dimensions. Whether it's a solution, I don't know. I mean, I sometimes feel the European Union sees it as a solution to just give you, to get back to the feedback loop and all that, because they changed from identity to belonging quite a lot recently, because it was a notion that they seemed people could relate to in better ways. Whether that's the case, I think this is questionable. But, you know, in some cases it's used as such. But for us, it was more like, okay, it might be worthwhile having a look at this when we talk about, you know, identification with Europe and spaces and how that plays out in different contexts. And I think what I also... both of you were commenting also, I think, Irene, in your case, you were saying, you know, how can we move away from political belonging? Isn't it always still political, the interventions? And I think that relates very much to your feedback loop remark, you know, aren't we still having these kind of parallel discourses and still this, how to say, impact of governance on these processes, even though they're developing locally? I think this is a very correct point where we really see that both, I think, also should not be seen as separate. I think they're always very, very much entangled, and we try to show that very much into the different studies that we look. Your questions about how to move away from that is, of course, a much more challenging one. I mean, if I just relate it to my own chapter, where I focus indeed on how, you know, cultural activists play with European funding, being very tactical with funding, trying to, oh yes, we deal with this, but in the end we do something quite different and instigate a really new process of belonging, is one way of making that move. And see also, because what I, for example, noticed is a lot of what these cultural actors are doing is actually a lot of what the European Union wants to do, but fails to achieve through its conditionality policies. This is a different way of dealing with that. So I think paying attention to these kind of trajectories of, in this case, policy making or how people work with this. I think the chapter on the Polish case in Warsaw is doing the same, where you see that the religious communities, to some extent, also very tactically work with both the institutionalized language as well as the languages within these communities. I think this is where we need to look at that multiscalarity of these kind of processes and to bring that at least to the foreground.
I think actually that relates. One of the chapters that I really liked was Margarzetta. Yeah, about the foreign heritage in Warsaw and how that has to live a parallel life to the official heritage, which is part of the national origin narratives. So that was also sort of struck me as an interesting example of, yes, you can have an alternative ways of belonging, but they cannot exist in the same discursive space as the recognized official heritage. So, and I feel like, yeah, that also relates to different meanings of belonging in different places. But I find the move from identity to belonging really interesting, because to me, and I'm thinking about Antheas, when some researchers who work with the idea of belonging, when they talk about it, they distinguish identity and belonging. Identity is something, is an act. It's you identify with something. It's so it's more of an active sort of becoming of the self, whilst and no one can force you to have an identity essentially in the same. But when it comes to belonging, the way Antheas speaks of it is that belonging is, it asks of you to whom and what you are a member. So where do you place yourself in the world place again? But yeah, so it asks of you where, like more localized where you belong. So I think it's great to try to move away from the place-based, the object-based sort of ideas of belonging, but for that to break through to a level where, yeah, where people can see that fluidity, yeah, it's a challenge.
Can I say something about identity? I actually really disagree with your notion of that it's something that you only do yourself to identify with, because actually there are powerful projections of identities of certain people or certain groups or certain organizations. So actually identity is actually something much less under control of individuals, if I may say so.
Yeah, but I think this is an ongoing debate, and we see that it starts to sort of, I don't know, enter into a conversation with each other. Yes, I think what we should do is just also to open up to the public, and if there's some other, themes we haven't talked about, we can still integrate them into what we talk about. If you want to ask a question, please wait for the microphone to arrive, as far as the instructions that I got. Yes, feel free to first Yolanda and then Guido. One at the back. She was the first.
It's already on? Thank you very much. I'm going to buy the book, of course. I think a lot of thrilling aspects being addressed here, and also a great roundtable. I've got a question that, of course, has nothing to do with what you have been researching, well, tangentially, of course. And it's about belonging and not belonging. But it's not one of the main objectives of your book, but have you already got an impression of what sort of factors impede belonging? Just thinking about policymakers and new projects, etc., etc. And the other question has to do what has been referred to as this spatial character of belonging, And it intersects with one of the questions Irene asked but has not been addressed. And that's the question, let's say, of belonging having also some sort of temporal dimension, since it also intersects with questions that have to do with nostalgia. So you can also feel this urge of this feeling of belonging because you inherently align with the past, imperial or whatever, well, you know what I mean. These are my questions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Do you want?
Shall I?
Yeah, that's
okay.
fine. I'll follow up.
So I think I would probably say, from my perspective at least, that seeing belonging as I said, as a reciprocal process rather than as something fixed. What impedes belonging is the lack of acceptance with whomever or wherever, whatever it is you wish to belong to or belong with. So inclusion and exclusion is part of the key point there. I don't know if you wanted to add anything different to that.
No, I fully agree. I was more thinking about sort of the concrete translation of that non-belonging, for example, in our book, because I do think it's very much there. Like, for example, in my own case, is that you see actually that, for example, in attempts to use the EU funding to create belonging, and by sort of letting people engage in these funding schemes and think along the European lines, this has resulted in a large feeling of non-belonging to Europe, where there was a very immediate mismatch between what was at stake locally in the settings, for example, of Bosnia or Serbia, where they really felt like what the European Union wants to do is creating a community of belonging, and we should all engage, and participate, and this will happen. But actually, we primarily do this because we need finances, but we really don't feel any sense of belonging in terms of the conditions or the foundations of what these schemes are about. To just give you one example, and I think we have throughout the book, in particular when you talk about the frictions that we have the museum example in Seagate, where you really see there is this construction of what these museums should look like, what stories they need to tell, very often framed in a very internationalized language or a very heavily loaded national government official language, which then really does not match, with what is at stake at the community surrounding. They're really creating non-belonging. Or the examples, I would say, of the Windrush or a few of the other exhibitions. Yes, you want to draw in the local communities, but what happens is actually that they don't really feel that they're heard or seen. So I think what we really try to do is see how this is continuously shifting, and of course there are cases where we really see, yes, this is like the case with the architectural interventions. Suddenly it becomes an invited space where people can belong, where communities were very marginalized. So we see these contexts as well. But I think it's part of the whole process we try to tackle throughout the book. And nostalgia, I think, this is a very good point, which is very much, not so much present.
Well, it's part of, in the introduction to the book, we wrote about a kind of tripartite way of thinking about belonging, one of which is spatial, one is social, and one is temporal. So it is there, but it's not pulled out perhaps so clearly through the chapters. But it's very much part of, for me at least, very much part of my understanding of belonging, that it has these multiple different ways, in which people attach themselves to, whether it's to, as you say, nostalgic feelings or sentiments or practices as well, or whether they're thinking about a particular space and place, or whether it's much more about a community and groups of people and that kind of social element. So we do see those three layers of belonging, and there may well be more that we haven't kind of identified overtly at the start of the book, but that is part of the foundation of how we see belonging. And in some of the chapters, probably fewer of them pick up on the temporal aspect of belonging. And I think more of the chapters pick up on the socially located and the spatially located belonging than the temporal aspect with nostalgia. But I think that's definitely an area, where there's scope to do more interesting and, some really potentially fascinating work to be done.
Or longing, literally, to a period. Exactly. I think it's in the term itself very much there. Guido?
I have so many questions. I don't know where to start. But thank you very much for all your contributions. It was really interesting. I was also puzzled by non-belonging, but partly you answered the question. Because I was thinking non-belonging is very strange because there's always some belonging, as if someone can't belong to nowhere, that's impossible. So I was wondering also, non-belonging, as far as I understood, that happens where people turn against this kind of sense of European belonging, but then probably they have another identification that they cling to. Right?
In my example, that was the case. I would argue there also, I think, quite strategic acts of non-belonging and not wanting to actually be part or taking a particular stance to that here. It's true if you talk about my example, but it's also, I think, a response of how, in this case, a community is framed, where you feel that you simply do not connect, do not feel attached, do not feel invited for several reasons. And it's also very much related to power asymmetries, that you actually have to accept a specific form of belonging that makes you feel that you don't belong because you actually have to adjust. So in this case of the European Union and how it's been related to that, I would argue yes, in particularly in the area I'm focusing on, which is non-EU, which is also former Yugoslavia, which has often been considered at the margins for several reasons. This is definitely very much part. And actually, coming back to nostalgia, the references to the socialist past is there much more a way of connecting and this line of argumentation. If we want to belong to the European community, at least they should pay attention to this. Is very much part of this bigger story. But I do think in the other chapter, non-belonging also comes to the foreground, but in different ways. And in particular to migration story, I think it's very, very often that non-belonging is fiercely experienced in how, processes of how do I fit into the society where I move to. And I think there are quite a few studies that focus also on that non-belonging aspect. So where are we in terms of these?
Can I add something to this?
Yeah, sure.
I think that in the idea of belonging, I think it always implicates non-belonging. That, I think, is the most important political aspect of thinking about these claims of belonging, because it's a claim about, it's not only on belonging, it's also on an ownership, which by definition excludes others from that access, or you see, so it's more maybe that.
I think I would just add that throughout the book we see belonging on multiple levels simultaneously. So it isn't all about belonging to the EU or to Europe. It's about belonging in the complexities and the layers of belonging and non-belonging that any individual or group may experience within the structures that that we've explored within the different chapters.
That's why Peter Geschiedenis speaks of the perils of belonging, because it has such a positive moral connotation, this belonging idea, but actually this danger always implicated in the whole idea.
Thanks, yes. And I was also interested in this temporal belonging that you talked about, because I was wondering, but did you focus also on generations? Because, for example, I very much identify. Identification is actually a word that I prefer above belonging or identity, but identification, especially because of it includes agency, human agency. But I identify very much with this golden age of European integration, from Maastricht somewhere to the constitutional crisis in 2005 or the banking crisis 2008, something like this. This is a period of time that I identify with. So for me, maybe also I'm nostalgic for that time, but that's the type of belonging that I identify with. But I'm also interested in the so-called millennials. It's a generation that comes after, more or less, because what I have the impression that their belonging is very much transnational also because of the digital age. They can identify with subcultures across Europe. They can identify with transnational left. They can identify with transnational right. For example, all these right-wingers that go to Poland or to Hungary, or, I don't know, all transnational left movements or transnational LGBT movements. So there's a transnational belonging in this generation that is totally out of disconnected from, I mean, not totally disconnected from space, but very much disconnected from space. So I was wondering how you include or would like to include this kind of temporal belonging in your research.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, and I think it's a point that we really barely touch on in this book, but that the chapters that deal with social media, connections to kind of movements of belonging and non-belonging. So the chapter that is about the fall of the Colston statue and the Black Lives Matter movement, or the chapter that David wrote about Kahlenberg and the far right, those are a little bit about those kind of the newer generational kind of movements around how they identify with, or whether they feel something belongs or they belong. And how it's mobilized through the kind of, as you say, the international social media and, all of those. But we really only touch on it, I think, in the book. One of the biggest challenges, I think, for a book like this is there are so many amazing and fascinating directions in which we could have taken it, and which we unfortunately couldn't, but that could be done, by others or by ourselves in future.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting because the idea of the attachment to place, it changes a lot. The sort of the settings that you would connect to or identify with between generations, and so it both changes in terms of the fabric of place and in the spaces. So yes, online, social media and such, but more interestingly also what places do these millennial generations and later on Gen X, where do they attach their sense of belonging, or where do they identify with more actively? And there's an interesting article on this actually. It's about third culture kids. It's by Leah Colemer. Yeah, Leia Colemer, as in Star Wars Leia. But she actually talks about, she has interviewed on social media and in real life kids of that are third culture because their parents come from different cultures and they live in a third culture in a different place because most of their parents are diplomats, or they're missionaries, or they have different types of sort of work around the world that brings their kids with them to different places. So they lived in 20 countries by the time they're 25 or 30 or something. So it's just an interesting case study because what they select as their place of belonging or where they identify with is airports. So we see airports as a non-space, so as an empty space sometimes, a place of transit, but they see that as the place where they meet people they know, where they have a lot of childhood memories, hanging out in airports, long layovers, having good time with their parents, finally getting to see them when they're not at work all the time. So for them, airports was, in this study at least that she did, was like a key place where they felt belonging. So it's an interesting thing.
I'm going to gather, I was one question here, and Tamara, and I said, looking a bit at time, maybe I'll gather them if there are any others that have some questions as well. Otherwise, I'll start with Maciej, and then we'll move to you, Tamara.
Thank you. And first of all, congratulations for the book, and it's very involving. I wanted to ask, maybe to come back to this more local level of your research, concrete spaces, concrete representations of memory. So when you were speaking about this negotiation of space or negotiation of memory, I think in order to negotiate, you need to have capital, and you have quite weak capital if you don't have this robust identity or belonging, like ethnicity, religion, gender, or some trauma or something like this. So I was thinking about situations where there is belonging, there are many people belonging and they feel this identity, but actually their narrative, their story is not so robust or not so strong. So they maybe just dwell, like linking to what you said, or I can think of people like, let's say, people with disabilities maybe, or people who are not necessarily immigrants, but are not enrooted in a particular place, or perhaps people with some other traumas like unemployment trauma or something like this. So how would you approach it in a research? Like how you would approach this absence of representation in the public space or public memory? Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'd also want to say an excellent discussion. Many thanks for that. Just to add to the third culture kid, which I'm almost, maybe the airports are nice because there isn't a dominant group. That's actually, you know, the belonging is also, I think, more of an issue when there is one dominant culture and people feel they have to. But that was not the question or not the thing I wanted to say. It's more connected to the previous question. I wonder whether belonging is also it's something which is more superfluous when you have the economic means. I wonder how much you looked at the economic capital. I mean, literally the capital. You know, whether indeed having this sense of the world as an oyster and I don't need belonging is something that is very much for the the happy few, and belonging becomes more of an issue the lower you are in the social class and the more dependent you are on the groups. I wondered how much that also came across in your research.
Okay, thanks a lot. You want to start? Shall I start?
I don't mind. I can start, shall I? And then you can, help me out.
Okay.
I think they're really challenging and important questions, actually, both of them. And they're things that we haven't kind of explicitly focused on within the research, although at the same time, thinking about your questions as you were saying them, I think probably within the book, what we have done is focus in a lot on the kind of the mediators, the people who are in the positions with some power and who are, you know, intending or trying to offer an opportunity for greater belonging. But we, you know, as was commented on, but very often it fails or it doesn't reach its potential, even though, you know, the intentions were there. So that really does highlight that there are problems in terms of, you know, who has the, whether it's the economic capital or whether it's the kind of power and the ability to be represented within the public space, whatever form of public space it is, that the mediators are really the ones who hold the power, and it is, you know, it so much hinges on what they can and can't achieve and what they want to achieve and why. So I think, you know, that's a partial answer. It's perhaps not quite where you were going. I don't know if you want to add.
No, I'm just thinking, we touched upon this, but I think we could have done it in a more nuanced way for listening now. I mean, I think we've touched upon power symmetries. We touched upon who decides, who does not decide, the dependency, for example, of museums on governmental structures. You know, we talked about these kind of matters which are, to some extent, at least related to what you're saying. But I like your idea of the sort of robustness also of the sense of belonging, which is also very important, and I would also argue that might actually be stronger amongst certain groups in society that feel rather marginalized, but they do not have the capital or the tools or the structures that support them in order to develop that. So I think it's a very interesting point you make that I think, for example, if I think of my own work, it's very much part of what I do, but it's a nice, I think your suggestion of framing it in that form is quite useful, particularly in relation to belonging and how that evolves. And it also relates, I think, Tamara, to what you were saying, in particular in times of neoliberalism. I think it's not only having the means, but also the approach to these kind of many of the projects, the sort of economic thinking, the ways in which structures work, still determine also, I would say, debates on belonging more forcefully than we often think. And it's true that those who speak that language is a certain group in society. And there I do think it does sort of, have effect also in that respect on what we're talking about. And I do touch upon that a little bit in relation to the funding schemes, but I think it's a much more sort of, a structured, powerful, sort of different rationales of thinking in the European framework that do offer different perspectives to different groups in terms of their search for belonging. So yeah, I think it's great that you mentioned this.
Yeah, I also think it's I think it's really interesting with the sort of that you noted the sense of, well, then we can go back to the idea of non-belonging, because that's a lot of what these groups feel, is that they do not belong, and people maybe to some extent tell them that they do not belong, but by not hiring them or whatever social situation people may be in. But this type of resentment that can build, and the type of hatred of this perceived feeling of really not belonging in the place where you were born, where you're supposed to belong, that is a key reason for why a lot of these, or key motivation or fuel for a lot of the far-right groups that, like some of the chapters note, and that David talks about too, even if he doesn't go into detail on that aspect. But that would be an interesting thing to look at further, is that power of non-belonging, the actual agency that comes with non-belonging, that you may create networks of people who feel the same way, whatever those may be, if it's, for example, Alfredo González Rebal, he has written about in Spain the idea of non-belonging, how that has led to a resurgence of the fascist movements, for example. And there for sure, non-belonging has become a strong sort of force that has driven a lot of communities to come together that haven't perhaps been politically organized before. It's ironic in a sense that their key argument, these movements, are that they belong in Europe, right? They are the only ones that belong, but they're driven by a sense of non-belonging. So, and as for by purchasing yourself belonging, I think that's really interesting too. I find it really interesting how people can buy citizenship now easily in different countries, for example. We've talked about these hard frames of belonging. So if you have enough money and you buy yourself a house in Greece, you get a citizenship in the bargain. So at least on paper, you can buy yourself a place somewhere. So, yeah.
I'm afraid we are run rather fast through times, and people might move on or at least join us for a drink afterwards. I thought this is, a good. It's probably we achieved what we wanted to do, to raise many more questions and to really think about future ways of researching this. I think there's a lot on the table that is worth looking at, and I'm sorry we haven't answered all your questions, but we can get back to that later. I want to thank the discussants for their really lovely comments to our book, and the audience for being here and to making this into a very nice event. And please join us for drinks if you still have time. Thank you so much.